One of the things that was controversial with Trump's first term and this particular election season is tariffs. Trump's view on tariffs is very different than the mainstream consensus. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on with that. Well, one of the problems with being a free trader, which I would consider myself in that camp, it's kind of similar to being an open borders advocate, which I would have considered myself a few years ago. However, it seems like reality is kind of forcing us to rethink some things. Whereas I would have assumed that open borders as a good would tend to outweigh negative benefits. Uh, Clearly, it became clear that the government is capable of intervening at all levels to turn any good into a bad. So, if the case is true with open borders, maybe it's similar or the same with free trade. Maybe it's not at all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe we were making an assumption that it's this ultimate good when we need to possibly rethink some of the cost benefit analysis. So we have an interesting conundrum. The US trade policy has essentially been a free trade policy since 1945, essentially favoring regional and world trade blocs. Now, Trump upended this by going to bilateral agreements and raising tariffs, especially against China. And everyone freaked out on this. But the interesting thing was the Biden administration responded to these high tariffs on China by leaving most of those tariffs in place. So, what is actually going on then? Well, we are beginning to see chaos. And, we've seen it definitely during this election cycle and leading up to it. And a lot of that chaos we are seeing is part of a realignment to the world order, the same world order that's been in place since 1945. Now, this neoliberal order is essentially made up of three major groups. One group says nothing's wrong, we're just going to keep doing things exactly the way we've been doing them forever. Then the other group are things are changing, but we can do this slowly and incrementally, just as long as we get Ukraine and Russia done first. And then the third group is we need to change fast because things are changing faster than what people are perceiving. So, what exactly is this neoliberal order? Well, again, as I mentioned, it's been in place since 1945. The idea is that the United States provides security and does most of the diplomacy for its clients. The US agrees to keep the sea lanes open, and things are negotiated through the globalization of world agreements. Now, part of this neoliberal order came on later on, and that would be in the form of the Great Red Hope, China. The idea was is once China looked like it was getting ready to play ball with the rest of the world, the neoliberal order decided that China was going to be the linchpin of the order. They assumed the Chinese economy would pretty much keep growing almost indefinitely. They assumed over time the Chinese economic policies would liberalize, and they assumed that China would slowly shift from nationalism to that of global order. Now, what came, in fact, was the Great Red Implosion. What's happening is the population of China is aging and falling at a very alarming rate. China actually has the most aging population on the planet, and their population is was listed as falling for the last 2 years, and the numbers are probably higher than what the Chinese are reporting. It appears that the Chinese economy is no longer capable of the growth it was doing. It seems like it's topping. And rather than becoming liberal, it's becoming illiberal and, in fact, nonsensical. Chinese government liberalization has come to a halt. And for a lot of the neoliberal order, they're still in denial over this. Now, here's where it starts changing. During Trump's first administration, he ended up hiring on Larry Kudlow, uh, which was very interesting because all up through the first 2 years of Trump's term, Kudlow was talking in alarmist fashion over Trump's ideas on tariffs. Kudlow and Trump met, and essentially, Kudlow, who is an economist and an adamant free trader, uh, changed almost overnight. Uh, Trump called him to become his economic advisor, and overnight, Kudlow went from being a free trader to the idea of trading on trade reciprocity. Started looking at the idea of bilateral agreements over global agreements, and was clearly okay with the Trump tariffs. Now, one thing we need to throw in here, because these guys always come up, this is Smoot and Hawley. They're the ones who made the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of the 1930s, and they're the boogeymen of free trade. Whenever free traders want to show you just how stupid you are if you're not a free trader, you see this picture. And the problem is that their narrative doesn't fit, because what happened was so first, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was put in place after the economies of the world were already starting to head into depression. So GDPs were already shrinking. And what Smoot and Hawley were attempting to do was stabilize agricultural goods for the United States. The United States did not negotiate with people. This bill was basically put in place unilaterally, slapping on massive tariffs across the globe. So what ended up happening was, since everyone was caught off guard, most countries retaliated. So although a very good boogeyman for free trade, it doesn't really fit the bill of that all tariffs are always bad and all trade agreements that aren't global are always bad. Now, here's a story that kind of comes out of this whole Kudlow situation that made me think twice. So, the example that was given was, so imagine we have a furniture company here in the United States, and this furniture company goes, geez, because of our wages, because of our environmental laws, because of all the other things we have to comply with here in the United States, it just doesn't make sense to have our factory open here anymore. And we're getting a great deal from Vietnam. They have the raw materials there. They have laborers who are ready to work. They have they basically have a good reputation as good workers. We don't have to pay them as much. Environmental laws aren't a problem. And the way we look at free trade is, the idea is, well, this should be a good deal automatically. I mean, free traders would almost tell you that if the Vietnamese factory could make the furniture for a penny less than the American factory, you should up and move. Now, mind you, that's kind of ludicrous, because I understand there's sunk costs, and you have to kind of consider what's coming in the future and what you got left behind in what you've already done. However, what we've discovered is that China and other countries weren't playing by the free trade model. So what would happen is when this company in the U.S. decided, like, hey, we're gonna up and move to Vietnam, China would intercede and say, hey, if you build this factory in Vietnam, we're not going to allow you to sell goods in China. And they're like, oh, so then what? China says, well, we got a deal for you. It's not nearly as good as the Vietnamese deal, but it is better than what you've got in your home country. So you really relocate to China and you'll have access to our market on our terms. So what happens here is, unlike the free traders would give us, saying, hey, we go for the best deal. It's good for all the consumers. The idea being that if the American consumer doesn't have to pay as much for their furniture, that frees up their money and resources to be buying other things, making other things, things that they're more competitive at. But doesn't that assume we're getting the best deal? But in fact, if China intercedes like the scenario says, they're not giving us the best deal, they're just giving us a better deal. So if the better deal gives us slightly cheaper furniture, is it going to free up the resources for us to make more competitive things? Is it going to free up our consumption resources to improve our standard of living? And I think there's some strong there's strength to this argument. I don't think anyone's proved it either way, though. But the question is I think this best deal versus better deal concept is something people are ignoring. And I think it may have part to do with some of the standard of living issues we've been having over the last 20 years. So when I heard that thing, that basically that scenario, that was kind of my oh crap moment where I said, ooh, okay. And again, I'm not foregoing free trade. I'm not saying, oh, I'm out of the free trade camp. I'm saying, okay, I think there's caveats. I think there's things involved that not everybody's thinking through. So, getting back to our neoliberal order, the grand flaw of neoliberalism tends to assume that the cost of security, no matter how high, balances out with the super goodness of free trade. And for many in the neoliberal order, this is practically a religious cost. Cost benefit does not matter if the order survives and is healthy. So, what you need to take out of this is essentially we have spent untold trillions amount of dollars. I mean, untold trillions amount of dollars since 1945 to present, supporting security of the oceans and foreign countries and all this other stuff on the assumption that the neoliberal order is generating a net benefit for the United States economy, or more specifically, a benefit to the standard of living of the American citizen. And since nobody's actually doing the cost benefit analysis, we can't say this is an absolute is the absolute case. So it may not be true. I suspect it's not. I expect the cost of the security state has been much higher than what we've gotten out of it. Okay. So, one of the things that's occurring and the thing that's driving the neoliberal order to shift is essentially population implosion. China, their population is falling. Europe's population has peaked and most of it's going to start falling. Some countries are already past the point of no return. Countries that are in a situation to benefit from this are actually the United States of America. We are one of the countries that would actually benefit from population implosion because it's not going to happen to us, at least with the current trends. And we also have we have room to correct at this point. So what will this population implosion cause? What happens as the neoliberal order changes? Well, there will be a shift towards regional trading away from the global blocks. More like regional, closer to home. So rather than like a North American free trade agreement trading with Europe, it's going to be more the North American free trade agreement trading with South America and the Caribbean. It's going to cause a shift towards regional security blocks, where we're going to see different countries forming up some kind of security unions that aren't completely dependent on the United States anymore. most of Europe is going to have a steep decline in their standard of living. So, what does this do then? Well, we have a bunch of unknowns, and essentially this is a recap of the unknowns that I've talked about through the video. So the questions is at what point does that Vietnam scenario I gave you wreck free trade doctrine? At what point does a best offer is the best offer ruined by a better offer? At what point does security spending become such a high cost that it swamps whatever benefits come from free trades? And then ultimately, can the U.S. maintain bilateral agreements in terms of trade that are net beneficial? And that'll take a lot of skill and a lot of forthright thinking that doesn't typically come out of Washington, D.C. Now, some people have been talking about what impact the tariffs themselves have. For instance, one thing Trump says is, well, the tariffs aren't really paid by us, they're paid by the foreign countries. And not really. But to a certain extent, the companies who are doing the importing are going to have to figure out ways to eat that cost, and some of that may actually come from the foreign companies subsidizing the companies to be able to pay for the imports. Could tariffs replace the income tax? Not as it currently stands. Essentially, the income tax draws in about $2.5 trillion, and we also have about $2.5 trillion worth of trade coming in. So if we set tariffs at 100%, we would generate the same amount as the income tax. However, obviously, you're not going to get the same amount of trade with tariffs at 100%. And but there's other things. I mean, we could do something crazy like spend less. and if we're generating a lot of internal economic activity, we could be generating a lot of additional fees and taxes in other places that could potentially offset income tax. Okay, so I think that covers what we have to say about tariffs, but for me, the bottom line is I still lean towards free trade, but I have it with a slight caveat where I go, I know there's a possibility that free trade doesn't work as well as it should in theory. So, with that said, please comment below if you've been following any of this tariff stuff. What do you think of it? Are you adamant free trader and think all this stuff is absolute hooey? Are you buying into Trump's arguments? Where do you think he's right? Where do you think he's wrong? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please check out my other titles. Surely you'll find something interesting. Consider subscribing. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.